Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. Last year I talked to Mark Felton about the escape attempts of British VIP prisoners held by the Italians. That was episode 49, Castle of Eagles. The book is possibly my favourite read of last year. Well, Mark's back with another cracking story he's managed to turn up in the archives. That of Operation Cowboy. The book is Ghost Riders. It recounts the activities of an American unit which raced into Czechoslovakia to accept the surrender of a group of Germans. In doing so, they managed to rescue a number of Allied POWs and, with the help of German POWs, they fought off a concerted attack by a SS unit, and then evacuated the mayors of the famous Viennese Spanish riding school. Patrons of the podcast will be aware that during my conversations, quite a bit never makes it into the final podcast, left on the cutting room floor. That's not to say it's worthless. It's perhaps off-topic, general World War II chat. But sometimes what you get in the podcast is all there is. When I do these extras, I like to share them with patrons of the show. Those people who, through a small contribution of $1 or so each month, help me find the time to put the podcast together. So, if you want more World War II chat, head to patreon.com/WW2podcast or www2podcast.com/donate for more details on how to become a patron. Mark, welcome back. For people to understand this, I guess the starting point needs to be for us to look at the Spanish riding school in Vienna. What is it? Why is it so special?
Well, the Lipizzaner horse is probably the purest bred horse that's left in existence today. They date all the way back to horses that were brought by the Moors into Spain in antiquity and bred with the Iberian horse and then later adopted by various European royal families. The Austro-Hungarian Empire were expert breeders of these horses primarily for their own entertainment purposes for the emperor at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. And it became a kind of I don't know how to really describe it. It's a living treasure, kind of white gold of Vienna. These horses that take years and years and years and years to train to perform these archaic maneuvers in front of an audience. It's a kind of fragment of a lost world which had almost entirely disappeared by the end of the 19th century, this kind of courtly, gentlemanly, chivalrous way of carrying on. And these horses represent very much the Austro-Hungarian Empire and how Vienna had been such a, how can I explain it, a cultural center in Europe for so long, and eventually it slid away after, World War I and lost its way. But this had endured, these Spanish riding school, these white Lipizzaner horses had endured. But of course they're incredibly fragile because they're so pure, they're carefully bred from an existing stock of mares. So if anything happens to those mares, it's the end of those stallions, it's the end of the Spanish riding school, it's the end of, 400 plus years of incredibly intense training and breeding.
They're one of those things that strangely I remember seeing on television as a kid. Now, I don't remember seeing them on now, but maybe I'd watched different programs as a kid than I do now, but they seem to be on TV. It's maybe Blue Peter or something. So I was curiously aware of them whilst I wasn't necessarily aware of this story. So how had the war affected the school? I mean, had things just carried on as normal, or were they sort of seen as some strange national pride? And sort of carrying on? Well,
I mean, you have the Anschluss in 1938 when Germany annexes Austria, and of course, what then happens is Colonel Alois Podhajski, who was in charge of the Spanish riding school, senior officer there, he's basically dragooned into the Wehrmacht, and he just changes over his uniform to become colonel in the German army. His job is to keep the Spanish riding school in existence, and indeed the actual performing animals are kept in Vienna. They're used as a tool for the Nazis to keep up, morale and propaganda, particularly once the bombing starts later on in the War of Vienna. So the Viennese, they're seen as a symbol. If the Spanish riding school left, it would be seen as the kind of end of Vienna in many ways, like the ravens in the Tower of London. The mares were kept as a separate stud in a place called Piva in Austria, and they were plundered by the Nazis and taken to Hostal in what is now Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and entered into this rather insane breeding program, this idea of creating this perfect Aryan horse, led by a guy called Gustav Rau, who's basically chief horse botherer in the Reich, if you like.
It's such a bizarre thing that they feel they had to have the perfect German horse. Was the Spanish riding school aware that their horses were being part of this eugenic program?
Absolutely. So Colonel Podhajski is absolutely horrified when he finds out that mares are being used for this sort of breeding program, and as well as the mares, they bring in other Spanish riding schools from Hungary and Yugoslavia. Royal studs there were brought in, and also you have lots of thoroughbred racing horses and Arabians, often stolen from Jewish families such as the Rothschilds in France. They're all brought into this program. And Colonel Podhajski tries his best to try to have this shut down, but as an Austrian, he can't really interfere with the German army chain of command, and Rau is so well connected with the higher Nazi leadership, he can carry on doing this. But the horses they produced were largely worthless. They were found to have deformities and various problems, because one of the things Rau is doing is he's very closely breeding closely related horses with each other, and horses that are very young as well, which is causing all sorts of problems. So Podhajski is tearing his hair out, trying to work out some way he can protect these animals from the Nazis, and of course he is not able to. All he can do is keep running the Spanish riding school until the bombs are falling, and then he's trying to think of a way to now save the stallions and remove them from Vienna before the whole place is obliterated.
It's only right at the end of the war that the school are allowed to evacuate from Vienna, isn't it?
It is, and it's down to this strange character, Baldur von Schirach, who was the Gauleiter of Vienna, former head of the Hitler Youth, and rabid Nazi, and born in America, strangely enough, with great American antecedents going back to sign as the Declaration of Independence. And he absolutely loved the Spanish riding school, and he resisted attempts to have it removed. But eventually he saw sense, and it was evacuated to a castle in Upper Austria, where they survived the war until the Americans arrived. But for the mares and some of the other stallions and some of these other horses, they were in a very precarious position in Hostal, which was what was called the Sudetenland, Bohemia, this kind of Germanic area of Czechoslovakia.
The period we're talking about, these closing weeks of the war, that's essentially, I don't know how to describe it, so it's like a slither of land is left squashed between the Russians and Americans. That's right, isn't it? Is that the way to describe it? A slither?
Yes, that's basically the situation. So the Red Army was advancing fairly rapidly through Austria, Eastern Austria, and through Eastern Czechoslovakia. Their aim was to take Prague and then move on from there and roll up to the Bavarian border. The agreement had been reached with the Americans that the state of what was Czechoslovakia would be under Soviet occupation after the war. So the poor old Czechs were basically handed over lock, stock and barrel to Stalin without any say in this, I have to say. And at the same time so the Red Army is about 40 miles from Hostal and advancing quickly. The other side, 20 miles away, General Patton's Third Army has come to a halt just inside the Czech border. And Patton is trying everything he can to try to get Eisenhower to give him permission to make a dash for Prague before the Russians get there. But, of course, international politics get in the way of that, and he's told to stay out and wait. So the guys at Hostal, they're left stuck in the middle, and they're either going to be swallowed up by the Red Army, or they can try to do something about this situation.
In this slither of German-occupied land? Is it packed full of Germans? Are they all compressed in there? Is it actually quite well defended? Might not be the way of putting it at this point in time, but is it full of disparate troops that have pushed into a very confined area?
Yeah, it's a real mess because you have German military units commanding the area, and they're relying to a very large degree on Volkssturm home guard raised from the local Sudeten Germans. The local Sudeten Germans probably outnumber the Czechs by about sort of 3-1 within that area. But there are a lot of Czechs there as well who hate the Germans, obviously, because of the horrendous things done, particularly by Heydrich and others. And there is a very well-organized communist Czech partisan movement that is intending to snatch some of this land as well, ahead of the Red Army. You have a lot of German civilians living there. These towns, if you go there today, all the names have changed, but they look strangely Bavarian, but a bit run down, etc. But they're basically German towns that they kicked all the Germans out of after the war and just simply changed the names over to Czech names. So the situation is pretty fluid. The Germans have established some defences along the Bohemian Forest border with Bavaria, but the bulk of the German forces are facing the Red Army, so it's absolutely everything they can pretty much put into the field to try to slow down the Red Army. And so in the west, facing the Americans, I mean, it's basically junk, but there is there's a couple of units, the 2nd Panzer Division, which has been reduced to about 2,000 men and about 10 tanks, and the 11th Panzer Division, which is sitting behind the lines quite close to hostile, about 11 miles away. They're about 12,000 strong, and they have Panzer tanks, but no fuel, which is another situation. So it could, if Patton had pushed in force, he would have met some quite sizable resistance behind the Volkssturm and the kind of, ear, nose, and throat units and things like this that are sort of being pushed out to try to defend these mountain passes and little logging trails through the forest.
I think that's probably we've set the scene for our operation, and what kicks it all off is, curiously, I think I'm right in saying it's not a move by the people in charge of the stud with the Mayses. It's a Luftwaffe Colonel Holters, who crosses the American lines. I think is that the kick-off for the story.
That is correct. Yeah, this guy, he commanded a unit called Demsteller Ost, which was an intelligence gathering unit on the Eastern Front. And so he's traveling with a convoy of trucks loaded to the gunnels with crates full of intelligence that he knows perfectly well would be a major bargaining chip with the Americans, because they know who their next enemy is going to be. And they ran out of fuel in the Bohemian Forest, and they took up residence in a hunting lodge not very far from hostile. And Holters, he's a rider himself, and he visits the stud and he talks to Colonel Rudowski, who runs the stud, and they become quite friendly, takes lots of photographs, and then he realizes, my God, this situation is absolutely appalling. So maybe I should go to the Americans and talk to them. So it becomes actually a sort of double mission in many ways. There's the mission to grab these documents and these valuable personnel, and at the same time the bargaining chip of perhaps an open negotiations and get some way to get these valuable horses and the 300 POWs that are there into Patton's lines as well.
Now, the Americans are 15 miles from the stud. Now, it doesn't sound very much, but as we say, yeah, it will be crossing the demarcation line, and they will be moving into the Russian area. So, and essentially, did the Americans even care? I mean, it's a Colonel Reed that he is brought before. I mean, we've seen Monuments Men. Do the Americans have teams of men roving, looking for Lipizzaner horses? Were they even on their radar as something of interest?
Not at all. They knew nothing about this. They had no awareness of this stud or anything at all. And Colonel Reed, who commands the 2nd Cavalry Group, which is the eyes and ears reconnaissance troops for the 3rd Army in that area, he is a major rider, and he was a reserve for the Olympic team and all this sort of stuff. And they all miss horses, these older cavalry guys. And when he gets wind of this, he realizes the value. He knows what Lipizzaner horses are and their value to European history. And it's he who goes to Patton on the radio and says, look, is there any way we can do something? And this is the kind of thing Patton loves. He loves these sort of, crazy, half-assed missions to go off and, behind enemy lines and rescue something. Because if it goes right, he gets fantastic publicity. If it goes wrong, well, Reed can take carry the can for that one, and that's made quite clear. But initially, they didn't want to go into Czechoslovakia. They wanted the Germans to bring the horses to Bavaria. And when that becomes impossible because of the resistance probably from other German forces in the area, they're left with no choice but to have to go in. And, you're playing with such a small amount of time because it's quite clear that the Russians are going to be there within 2 or 3 days. At the outside, it's quite obvious. The distance is only 40-odd miles from their lines. So one quick push, they have taken Hostal. They were well aware because Holt has told them what happened to other Lipizzaner horses which were captured by the Russians in transit. We know at least 15 were shot for rations at one point, and another group were basically harnessed as dray horses and never seen again. So, it's not going to be a happy ending for anybody. And the staff have their families there as well. Young children living on site. So the horror of what would happen when the Soviets rolled up had already been played out, is being played out in Berlin at that moment, and had been played out particularly at a place called Nemmersdorf in East Prussia, which had been widely disseminated to the German population that, they'll rape everybody, kill everybody, destroy everything, and you must resist as long as possible,
One of the remarkable things that struck me about this story is the bravery of the men that crossed the front line to organise this before the column, almost before the column even moves, because they first the Germans have to come over. The Germans, they send an American over, and then they get in touch with Colonel Rudowski in charge of Hostal, and he sends over his envoy. The bravery of these men passing through lines where one would assume at any point you could be shot, because presumably the lines aren't necessarily aware of what's coming through.
No, these negotiations are top secret. Rudowski is terrified somebody will find out, particularly his commanding general, and he will be put up against the wall and shot as a traitor. There are SS within this area, and they become more of a problem later on. There are local Nazis who arm themselves and form Volkssturm. At one point, as you mentioned, these envoys traveling backwards and forwards, we have Captain Lessing, who is one of the veterinarians, the German veterinarians. He's traveling with Captain Stuart, who's an emissary from Colonel Reed. And, of course, they get captured by local Volkssturm who want to basically shoot them. And they're very lucky to get away with it. It is only the fact that Lessing had been issued a pass and permission to do this negotiation by a higher general who basically washed his hands of the situation. He thought, well, okay, fine, get the horses out, but we're not going to stop fighting the Americans, and it doesn't affect our defense of the frontier or the Reich. Even when Hitler's dead, when they find out the day after, it doesn't really affect their ability to continue to resist. Grand Admiral Dönitz's new government tells them to carry on, get on with it, which they do to some degree.
It's such a confusing situation that they're having to deal with. Now, we mentioned Captain Rudowski, who's in charge of the stud at Hostal. Was he a Nazi? Was he inclined to want to surrender the horses, or?
No, Colonel Rudowski he was a Czech, Sudeten German. He'd served in the Czech army for many years. He was one of their foremost experts on horse breeding and carriage driving, training of carriage drivers, etc. He's a bit of a stiff and upright sort of character, and he's also somebody who has taken an oath, as all German officers did, to Adolf Hitler personally. And these people are not that disposed to break this oath. He feels, I think, also that if something goes wrong with the negotiations, he will be executed. And whether that was worth that or not, I don't know. But he's also worried about he has relatives nearby, he has an elderly mother living nearby, a nephew. etc., a sister-in-law, and, they know the Russians are coming. So, these people are put in a terrible, terrible situation where they have to take a really big chance on an unknown quantity, which is the American army.
Had he any orders what to do if could? Was he to sit tight or move or?
Yes, he radioed Berlin for instructions, and he was told to stay put and do nothing, carry on as normal, and that I think changed his mind about allowing these negotiations to go forward. Because when he initially found out these negotiations had been happening basically behind his back, he wasn't best pleased, as you can imagine. But then the other officers talked to him, Lessing and Dr. Kroll, another one of the veterinarians, and they basically said, we have no choice. You either sit here and let the Russians arrive and kill everybody and the horses, and you end up maybe as a POW in Siberia or something, or you do this and you have to go against what you've been ordered to do. And of course, by that stage, the resistance in Berlin is almost over anyway. So you've got to do something.
Yeah, well, this is all framed obviously in the background of the bomb plot against Hitler, and people were being still hung for dissension even as late in the war as this, when it was, well, it's easy now to say, but the cards were on the table of what was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, everything's up for grabs, and I mean, these people, by this stage, they're looking at their wives and kids, and they're thinking, well, okay, I've done my duty, but now my duty has to lie with saving my family. And they look at those horses which they have spent, years caring for and looking after and trying to improve. And I think that they also felt that, no, we don't want to see all of this just swept away either. It's too much to bear.
So when the Americans send in their column, I guess there's two ways you could do this. You could send a very small unit in and hope it could get in and out very quick, or you could send in a mighty fist that grabs and bites out an enormous piece of land that you then defend. What did the Americans do? How did they choose to send in their troops?
Well, because they were under terrible pressure to get on with other operations elsewhere. So Patton basically detaches most of the 2nd Cavalry to go off and do other things. They're left with basically one squadron, one reconnaissance squadron, a couple of 5 Chaffee tanks, which are about as much use as a chocolate teapot if you actually come up against any German armour, and a few M8 armoured cars and jeeps and all this, and these howitzer motor carriages. What I always say is the task force that is sent is big enough to be noticed by the Germans, but not strong enough to actually defend itself if the Germans decide to do anything about it. And although the stud is basically disarmed and they're waiting to surrender, the Americans do have to break through the frontline crust of German defences, race in 22 miles to this place, capture it, and then not leave. They've got to hold the place for some time, because the realization was one of the reasons why the Germans refused to move the horses to Bavaria was because it was the foaling season, and you can't move heavily pregnant mares and these young foals just yet. You've got to wait a while. So this terrible, fact of nature comes into play, that once we take the stud, we can evacuate the POWs and take out some of the Germans, but we've basically got to hold it, this little town in the middle of nowhere in the forest, for a number of days, whilst we know perfectly well that evil eyes are watching us from the forests, and also the Soviet juggernaut is coming on. So it's very, very tense, very, very tense indeed.
Where do the civilians' allegiance lie in this part of Czechoslovakia?
Well, the Sudetenland Germans are with the Germans, by and large. They are also worried about their own futures because, the other thing is that the roads and around this place are absolutely crammed with refugees from the east, Germans fleeing the Soviets, and also with sick animals. So the stud has been overwhelmed by huge numbers of animals being brought in, mostly horses, to be dealt with, as well as all these very precious and expensive animals. So the vets are worked, virtually to death by this. It's a terrible situation, and all this human misery. I mean, that place had been untouched throughout the whole of World War II, this, bucolic, wonderful place. It is a very beautiful place if you go there today, but suddenly for the first time in the last couple of 3 weeks, they have seen the human misery and everything else coming past, and it's quite obvious the writing is 100% on the wall. However, being Germans, they will continue to do their duty and follow orders, and this is the case for the military units. They will do their best to try to resist any encroachment by Patton's forces into that part of Bohemia. And so they do have to basically kick the door in, and the first thing they do is launch a fairly vicious artillery barrage onto a couple of these towns, killing a lot of people in order to, open the way in. And, as they come in, they're shot at on many occasions, and they shoot an awful lot of underage and overage Germans and the Volkssturm and all this lot who put up any resistance, but they have no choice. You've got to get the job done and get a move on. So each town they come across, it's always this fear, is this going to be another battle or not? And some of them are and some of them are not. And for guys who've, as I mentioned before, have done this for 9 months now, it's, you're thinking, do I want to be the last GI who gets shot in the EPO? This is the thing. There's a great pressure amongst these soldiers and the officers to get it done fast. And in fact, that is Patton's orders, get it done fast. That's the verbatim quote from Patton. And indeed, that is what they try to do.
So this is Task Force Stuart, named after Captain Stuart, who leads a column. So what's the situation at Hostal when they arrive?
The situation is a bit alarming. Not only the refugees, they've had a few artillery shells drop very close to where the horses are being kept in the paddocks. They're probably stray American rounds, and that upset everybody. They're constantly monitoring the situation, thinking, well, where are the Russians? Where are the Russians? And they're getting more information about this. They're also aware some quite sizable German forces are moving through the region, and we get the first wafts in the air of possible SS units moving up from Austria, and of course that eventually comes to a collision point between the Americans and the SS at the stud.
So there's 500 to 600 horses at the stud. Now I did a quick Wikipedia on how many acres you need for a horse, and it's 1 to 2 acres per horse. So if you say there's around 1,000 acres, it's an enormous area to cover, and it's only a small column expected to defend this perimeter. I mean, was it even possible to defend the perimeter against any incursion from a determined German force?
Well, this is where it becomes rather unique in the history of World War II, because Stuart is placed in charge. It's actually Task Force Andrews to start with, but then Major Andrews leaves, and then it becomes Task Force Stuart as he takes command of this much reduced. He's basically got one squadron and a few of these tanks and whatever. Sorry, not one squadron, one company to defend this entire village. And it's a fairly sizable place. I mean, it's not, even today it hasn't changed much. It's still a fairly sizable small town, if you like. And there's an awful lot of roads in and out. There's a lot of forest and hills and everything else. And there's no way on earth the Americans can defend this properly. So he's put in this position of having to ask prisoners of war, Allied POWs, whether they would like to be rearmed and help. And indeed, many of them, lots of Poles and Slovaks, some British and French, they had actually been working at the stud as grooms, forced into this sort of situation. If you remember the wonderful film Hannibal Brooks, where they're all working in the zoo, and yes, that's basically what happened. So they're in there, and they feel an attachment both to these animals and to some of the people at the stud, some of the Germans and Czechs, and they don't want anything bad to happen, so they happily, I have to say, the British over keenly, and a few Kiwis can't wait to snatch up a few German rifles and get on the line. And then that's not enough men. So Stuart now turns to Rudowski, and they basically decide to use some of the Germans that they took prisoners, some of the disarmed soldiers. And these guys are field expedient rearmed and, put into the line. So then you have this unique thing of POWs, Germans in German uniforms, and US soldiers manning the same things together. And, of course, it becomes known as Stuart's Foreign Legion.
And indeed, it's pertinent as far as they're attacked. The SS Deutschland, 111th Battalion, do attack? I mean, do they hold together and fight as some sort of composite unit, or do the Germans?
Yeah, this was. I think I was the first historian to really establish who the hell they were, because everybody else just talks about SS, and I did a hell of a lot of research trying to find out who it was and where they came from, and I've established that they were part of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, which is probably the best of the SS fighting forces, but also one of the most brutal. I mean, they committed horrendous atrocities, Oradour-sur-Glane, for example, in France, etc. So, the kind of guys you want to mess with. This particular part of the unit, Panzergrenadier Regiment Deutschland, had been fighting in Austria against the Americans, had been badly drubbed, and sections of it had headed up into the Czech Republic. Why they attacked the stud, I don't know. I can only presume they were fairly cheesed off to see the Americans occupying somewhere that's way behind the German lines. And of course, they probably knew the value of the horses, as did many other Germans, so perhaps it was a bargaining chip if they could get them. But they certainly tried twice. There were 2 fairly hair-raising ding-dongs, but the one thing was that the Germans lacked any armour or vehicles of any kind. They were on foot, and apart from their personal weapons, they had no way of really pressing this attack. And of course, the American Stuart they have their 60mm mortars, they have their howitzer motor carriages, they have their M8s, etc., and these Chaffee tanks, and they shot down an awful lot of them in the snow and took quite a few prisoner. But there was a couple of persistent attacks, and it could have gone the other way. I mean, if Stuart hadn't raised this Foreign Legion, I think they'd been so short-staffed that they couldn't possibly have held the stud, and the SS would have got in there. And then you can imagine what would have happened to people like Rudowski and others. They would have been shot for treason.
Well, it's a remarkable action, and presumably the Germans that were armed, and there's some Cossacks in there who'd been fighting for the Germans. Presumably they thought they'd thrown in a lot with the Americans now, so they better hang on in with them.
I know. I mean, this story has got everything. It's amazing. Yeah, we've got Cossacks as well, and a Cossack prince, no less, Lieutenant Colonel Prince Amazov, with his wife and daughter and about 25 or so of his men, and they marched all the way in from Poland with hundreds of horses, etc. And they saw a way to get themselves basically to safety by working with the Americans. They hated the communists, of course, and we all know what happened to the Viennese Cossacks, what the British did to them, unfortunately, by sending them back to Stalin's Russia, where they were largely executed along with their families after being taken prisoner in Italy. It's a dangerous situation, but it's one which works out brilliantly. So you have this, the operation is amazing. You've got mounted Cossacks, you've got Germans on horses, American guys from Texas, and you have Brits, you've got the lot. I mean, it's truly extraordinary. And I think a lot of people would probably think it's fiction. If you haven't got enough, if you don't read the book, you could fall into the thing of thinking this is made up, but it's not at all.
Well, it does sound like some sort of slightly peculiar 70s Hollywood film where everyone fights together. Because, of course, then after all that, the Russians do indeed roll up. So you have every actor is there, is catered for.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I was very surprised how Reed faced them down, because literally, they're preparing Operation Cowboy. They've been working like crazy to convert Opel Blitz trucks and American 6x6s and everything into these SATS horse carriers to try to move these animals to Bavaria safely, and a lot of them will be ridden as well and somehow protected. But then, just as they're getting ready to go, they're working really fast trying to get all this sorted. A big line of T-34 tanks rolls up at the eastern side of the village, is stopped by the Americans on guard there. And, the Russians don't really want to stop. There's a fair amount of shouting and gesticulating and, clear a path for the Red Army and all this. And they're well within their rights. They are well aware that Czechoslovakia belongs to them. And what the hell are a load of Americans doing 20 miles inside the border? Get lost. But Reed is able to face them down and warn them off. And, it's a case of who blinks first. And in this case, the Brigadier General Fominich of the Red Army blinks first. He decides not to open fire or try to push this with the Americans. But it shows you also it's a new dynamic, which is the beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War begins in the last few days of World War II. And it really starts. It could have easily turned into a shooting match, and God knows what would have happened then.
It's a remarkable piece of chutzpah just to sort of delay them, because the Americans can't stay where they are, so they do have to evacuate the horses. I mean, you've got 500 or 600 horses. It's a hell of an evacuation to organise, and with a large number of them pregnant. It's one of those things, and even it's when you get them all out, where are you going to put? Do they have any idea? Just the logistics. Trucks to put them on. You've got to take them somewhere. Then you've got to feed them.
It's a total nightmare. I mean, they send on guys, particularly the vets, German vets, go on with escorts to Bavaria, and they're going around everywhere trying to find anywhere where you could possibly put horses, and whether the local peasantry will feed them properly and look after them, and whether the Spanish riding school horses can be kept together before they're, eventually returned to Austria at some point. And it's a logistical nightmare. They simply don't have enough tracks, because a recon unit, it's the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron that undertakes this operation. They only have about 15 trucks in the entire unit, and they're being used to haul ammo and everything else. And a few half tracks, you don't have enough equipment. So somebody has to go off and lead a raid on an abandoned Luftwaffe air base and try to nick all the trucks that everybody left behind. It's that desperate. So you've got Germans driving the trucks, Americans driving the trucks, Poles driving the trucks, everybody mucking in together, excuse the pun, to get this, sorted out, to save their own necks and save the horses. And I think, Colonel Reed summed it up very well when he said about this operation. He said, we just wanted to do something beautiful. And I suppose after all that blood and guts and death and everything else, those horses, in their innocence, they represented something which appealed to men who'd been through so much death. And to see those horses with foals and everything else, it was something they could physically do to give something back in some way, to make things better, both for themselves as men, I think, and also for the nation and for Europe.
Yeah, and that's Operation Cowboy, the removal of the horse, which I thought was a superb name. But is there still a riding school for once you've got these horses to belong to? What's happened to Colonel Podhaisky? Well, he's had all sorts of travails himself, because if you remember, he managed to get the about 70 of the actual performing animals, the stallions, moved to a castle in Upper Austria. And of course, he was in the same situation of fearing the arrival of the Russians, who were pushing through Austria the same, and also worrying about the arrival of the Americans. And eventually he's put in charge of the local defenses in the town where he's stationed. And that's the last thing he wants to do, because he realizes that if they show any resistance to the Americans, I mean, he's got the local, Nazi Kreisleiter breathing down his neck the whole time. If he doesn't do what they want, he'll be removed from command, possibly shot. And then with him gone, what happens to the Spanish riding school? But if he shows any kind of resistance, the Americans have a new tactic. They simply blast the living daylights out of any town that shows any kind of resistance, because they can't be asked for the casualties. So what you end up with is a lot of dead horses and dead men and destruction. So he has to very cleverly worm his way through this situation, which he does brilliantly, and manages to ingratiate himself with the Americans, and to get somebody interested who will protect the horses. And then, of course, when Patton actually comes up there to do a visit, they put on a display for him, and Patton is suitably impressed and tells them, well, you can consider the Spanish riding school to be under U.S. Army protection from now on, which is great, The slightly peculiar thing, interesting, I don't know, that I thought was the fact that through all these men, and the men that they bump into, in the background, there's the Olympics. They all have a common the common background is not just horses, but it's the Olympics, and they're all seemingly aware of one another. and it's just luck.
Yeah, it seems the horse world was small. And you're quite right. The 36 Berlin Olympics, the Nazi Olympics, Podhajski had won a bronze in dressage, I think it was. Reed had attended as part of a reserve team. Patton had been at the 1912 Olympics himself, and I'm sure showed a lot of interest subsequently. So yes, there was that Olympic spirit running through it, and I have to say it's really an international effort to save what is basically an Austrian national treasure, and the Austrians are indeed very grateful today to all of those different players who did that.
Was there ever any comeback for the Americans essentially stealing the horses?
Yeah, this is one of the things I found in the archives. We had quite a bit of trouble in the archives in America because some things had been removed quite clearly at some point. And what was going on was the Czech government, the communist Czech government as it became, they launched a complaint against the United States saying that those horses were Czech property because they were on Czech lands and they should be returned to Czechoslovakia, and you basically nicked them. The Americans were very sensitive to this, and there were great, long-winded, massive documents, basically justifying what they did. But one of the problems was, although they hived off the Lipizzanas that belonged to the Spanish riding school, and they were actually returned to Austria without any problems, they shipped out to the US a lot of thoroughbred racing horses and other Lipizzana horses from other collections which fell under communists, such as Hungary, Romania, places like this. And they were never seen again in Europe. They were sold off very cheaply. Some of them were very, very famous racehorses that won, all the major prizes pre-war, and they were not necessarily returned to their owners. And some of the officers indeed had some of these horses as private mounts that they took. So there was a bit of an element of that, and I think the American government were keen that was not to be known too widely. But overall, however, regarding the Spanish riding school, that was handed over without any problems. And there was another operation, in fact, to take all of those mares and some of the stallions up into Austria, and that was another major ordeal for the US Army to do that. And then they were billeted on an old Luftwaffe airfield where Podhajski is reunited with these animals. But then they face a new problem. Vienna is occupied by the Soviets, so they're not going back to the Hofburg Palace anytime soon. And in fact, I think it was 1955 before they were finally able to return to where they currently are. And this whole story basically ended.
Well, Mark, it's a fantastic story. One of those where the truth is almost stranger than fiction. Thanks for sharing it with us. Mark's book is Ghost Riders, Operation Cowboy. Like Castle of Eagles, it's another rip-roaring read. I will put a link on the website. For patrons of the podcast, I think I'll have a bit more of Mark and I chatting. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. That's it for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.